I think we're all here again, are we? Yeah. Well, we're going to go into the questions and answers session now and the feedback from the roundtable discussion. And as you will see, there are ladies with their hands up, the mics as we call them, and we'll take the questions in succession. But can I ask you, as I have done on previous occasion, to keep the introductions and the questions as brief as possible. So we want to make the best use of the time we have, so that it will be achieved if that course is adopted. So put up your hand if you want to ask a question.
Thank you, Judge. I am the facilitator for table number 13. I have two questions here for the panel. The first question is for Anne Graham. What are the future plans for transport in rural Ireland? The second question for Dr. Caulfield is, if you had to pick one pilot programme to introduce, which would it be and why? Finally, some of the members of the table expressed concern, and I just wanted to highlight this, on the financial cost of school bus services for both levels, primary and secondary. And they felt that changing this would reduce forced ownership of cars, and they just kind of wanted me to highlight this and pass it back to the panel to see what they thought. Thank you.
Yeah, well, we'll start with Anne's question.
So in terms of the future plans for transport in rural Ireland, we operate and manage a rural transport scheme on behalf of the department. So there are, rural transport bus services. 80% of those services are demand responsive, as Brian showed in his slide. So you call up and book a service. And they were originally funded through the Pobal services, the community-based transport, but now it's kind of formalised as part of our public transport system. And what we're trying to do is integrate that public transport with our main public transport services that are generally provided by Bus Éireann. So there are some services around rural Ireland already. We want to increase those services, and we've an additional $500,000 to invest in those services next year. So we want to increase the number of those services. We introduced some services in Cavan Town recently, and all across rural Ireland, about 27 new services this year. So we want to improve and continue to improve those services. And then in our rural towns, we also have found that we don't have bus services, even in some of our larger towns. So we've just tendered a service for a bus service for Kilkenny. So you would imagine that a town, city the size of Kilkenny would have a good bus service, but it doesn't. So we're providing a bus service that we hope to have operational next year.
Very good. Would you like to comment on the comment made at the end?
On the school bus,
yes.
well,
Yes.
We don't manage the school bus service,
Right.
but obviously, we would encourage, and it is an important scheme because it does reduce the amount of travel by car to school. So we would not want to see that scheme undermined in any way, and that's really the comment that we would make as an authority.
Very good. Brian?
Okay, it's a very good question. What pilot scheme would I think of? What I would suggest will be a behavioural scheme whereby you give people information on their travel and transport. It's not a new mode of transport, or it's not changing a mode of transport. It's just to give people feedback on the actual cost of their transport, and then also the actual cost of their emissions. So it could be by smartphone, or it could be by public awareness. I think that would be very good. Whereby we get a kind of feel for how people are travelling, and then offer alternatives, and then maybe say that you could take these alternatives to reduce emissions. So I think awareness would be a really good pilot programme to launch.
Yes. And do you have a comment on the school bus comment?
I've no comment on that, but yeah, I agree that it could cause forced car ownership if these services are reduced.
Yeah, very good. Yes. We'll take another question, yeah.
Table 12 and then table 1.
Yeah. Table 12, yes.
Okay, I'm the facilitator for table 12. The citizens at this table have one question and two comments. The first question is policy making the remit of the Department of Transport or the Department of Communications, or both? And the other two are comments. So maybe we could ask the question first.
Yeah, no, let us have the comments.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I thought that the role of the planning section has a complete disconnect with reality as regards rural citizens. And it goes back to our last session as well as regards retrofitting your house and the electric cars. And it's just an example. In a lot of the instances, the cost of actually getting the things done that you need to do to become carbon neutral is completely beyond the budget outlay of all of the citizens, because they don't have that amount of cash in one go in order to be able to buy an electric car. And for rural people, their car, they're not in love with their car. It's a necessary evil. We have no other choice. We can't live without them. It's not our fault. We can't get anywhere. We've no infrastructure. We can't even get, like, I live a mile away from my local shop, 5 miles away from my local town, and about 50 miles away from my job. So if I don't have a car, I can't work. I can't provide for my family. And I just think that there's a disconnect. We'd all love to be able to do everything that we have, and we know it would save money in the long run, but because of negative equity and all of the pressures that most of the citizens are under, it's beyond our capabilities to be able to do these things.
Thank you very much.
Hello there. My name is John Long, citizen table 12. Just a comment from the Department of Transport and for Anne Graham. Now, just to say that we all know it's a time of change, and it's essential that we move away from private transport and move towards public transport. But unfortunately, a lot of people believe that the Department of Transport seems to be against the funding of public transport and against any realistic subsidies for it. As a matter of fact, they seem to be determined to confront the public transport workers and make them a low-wage job. And also, more importantly, it seems to be ideologically committed to privatisation, which would probably be a disaster. So how can we move towards a better and more important public transport system, and with a proper policy, without deciding on an actual public model?
Well, we'll take the question first of all. And is it the Department of Transport, or is it?
It's both.
It's both. I
yes.
that
So
would
in
be your
terms of
answer,
transport, the Department of Transport, Tourism and Sport would have the primary focus
Yes.
in relation to transport policy
And it's your
support
boss.
it. Yeah.
It's your boss. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then the involvement of Minister Naughton's department.
Would also be involved, and they would have kind of shared responsibility in terms of some of the grants and some of the actions associated with trying to encourage some moves towards an overall, I suppose, coordination of policy in terms of climate change.
Yeah.
But the Department of Transport would have a particular focus on the transport elements.
Do either of you want to make any comment on the comments? I assume you understand the position in comment 1.
Yes, and I suppose when we were looking at how to plan, it was more about planning for the future and trying to plan where it wasn't really dealing with, I suppose, some of the legacy issues that we have about where people live and where people work. It's more about thinking about the future, and future planning is where we should try and locate where people are living and where people are working, and where they need to shop, all in as close as possible to one another. So that's about the future.
Yes.
And, you know, in terms of public transport, the department and the NTA are committed to funding and continuing to fund public transport. And our subsidy, while it did decrease during the economic downturn, is now increasing again, which has allowed us to put in place additional services. And I mean, our mission is really to improve public transport and have more people using public transport. So, you know, and it is for it to remain within the authority as a public good, you know, and provided for the public. But there are different models and delivery models that are available to us to put forward, but it will remain a public good.
Yes, very good. Brian, would you like to comment on the comments?
Sure, yeah. Just about the comment about being in love with our car. I agree, and I think that in some cases, as was mentioned before, it's around this forced car ownership that, you know, in your case about driving the 50 miles to work, it is a forced car ownership thing, that there isn't an alternative.
Yes.
I didn't mean to be facetious in the way I put it forward, but that cars will always play a part in our transport model. And as we move forward, as we change where employment is located, those kind of instances probably should reduce. But if it's not possible, that there are more sustainable methods, in that case it may be an electric vehicle. And then just to comment about the price of electric vehicles and the cost, etc. It's one of the things that I've been thinking about quite a bit, that should the incentives that are placed in Dublin, where you would have a very good public transport network, should the incentive in Dublin be the exact same as the incentive in somewhere in rural Ireland? Should it be different when there is a lack of an alternative?
Yeah, yeah. That's an interesting point, that last comment, yeah, yeah. Thank you very much. I'll take another question from table 1.
I'm the facilitator for Table 1. The citizens at this table had one question for Dr. Brian Caulfield. On your slides, on one of the slides, you compared the CO2 emissions of a return flight from Dublin to London to the number of kilometres a car would have to drive. Could you just clarify, is that per person or per plane?
It was the calculator that I used. This was the slide that was added late into the presentation because I knew there was information required on aviation, but the calculator that I used did say it was per person. I may be incorrect. It's something that I can feedback later on and maybe change the slide and put in a reference.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Table 11.
Judge, I'm the facilitator for Table 11. I'm one of the citizens at the table who would like to ask the following question of Dr. Caulfield. What practical steps could we take to reduce emissions in public transport?
There are a number of practical steps that we can take to reduce emissions. It is, as Anne mentioned in her presentation, maybe more detail, that we change the fuel types that our vehicles are using. We've done some scenario analysis on this on an EPA-funded project, that we can reduce our emissions quite a bit by changing the fuel mix for buses. Electrification of rail will result in a large decrease in emissions. Not only CO2 emissions, but in our cities as well, it will reduce particulate matter and NOx, which again, as I said before, are very bad pollutants in terms of our public health. That would be the main way in which we could reduce our emissions.
Thank you very much. Table 9, yes.
Good morning, Judge and the Chair. I'm the facilitator for table number 9. The citizen had 3 short questions, and I'll address them to the Chair. Number 1, there was a comment from the Chair in respect to the viability of a railway service in less densely populated areas. The citizens at the table were particularly curious as to whether or not there is actually any plans to maintain railways around rural areas, particularly the west of Ireland. Question number 2, are there any plans or policies to introduce congestion charges in Dublin or any of the other cities in Ireland? And number 3, the citizens at the table were very curious about the demand response buses, and they want to know whether or not there's any realistic plans to implement them in Ireland.
Demand response buses. Oh yeah, yeah. Yes.
I might start with that. In terms of the viability of rail services across Ireland, we published a rail review last year which outlined the costs of operating rail services right across the state. And there's no doubt that in some of the more low populated areas, the cost of per passenger of providing a rail service is higher than it would be in the city regions. But there are no decisions. What we did was we put that out for public consultation just to show what's involved in terms of delivery of a rail service in very low populated areas. But there's no decisions have been made to reduce any services in any part of the state at this time. And in terms of the congestion charges, any plans, again, there are no plans to provide congestion charging in any of our cities. But one of the things that we have to consider is that, that there is an alternative, so that before you would put in place any congestion charging, that you would have a very high level of public transport usage and availability of public transport as well, so that people have a choice to transfer to public transport. But the other areas, like congestion charging, is just one mechanism of reducing demand. There are others, such things as parking charges or other means where you might kind of restrict the access to an area. The provision of higher priority on bus corridors, on radial corridors, which kind of reduces the road space for cars, is actually also a measure which, while it improves public transport, reduces also can reduce demand for cars. So there's other things and other tools that I think would be considered first before we would actually consider a congestion charge in our cities. And in terms of, as I indicated, we do have demand responsive services in rural Ireland. 80% of the public transport that we provide in rural areas is actually demand responsive, and we would obviously like to expand that where those services don't exist.
And can I just ask, is it the local authorities who are responsible?
Who manage? No,
for the parking charges.
For the parking charges, it's local
yes,
authorities. Yes.
There was some mention during the week that they were going to go up in Dublin.
But it is a
quite
means
an extent
of controlling, demand for
of
car into cities. It's one, financial way of, rather than introducing a congestion charge.
Yeah. Brian, would you like to comment on any of those
Sure.
questions?
I think the only one that I can add anything different to is on the congestion charging, and it's just to give an example. The example is of Stockholm, a city pretty similar in size to Dublin, and what they did there was very citizen focused. What they did was the city council said they were introducing a congestion charge on a trial basis for 6 months. Prior to the congestion charge being implemented, there was a lot of public transport improvements around buses and park and rides. So then the congestion charge was introduced. The people then decided whether or not they wanted to keep it, and it was kept. So again, it's a citizen focus that they did in Stockholm, and it's a similar size to Dublin.
Very good, thank you.
We're now going to table 5.
Yeah. And then we'll come to table 7. Sorry. Table 5.
Thank you, Judge. I'm the facilitator for table 5. Citizens at this table have asked me to put 2 questions to the panel, and 2 other citizens at the table would also like to have put their questions to the panel as well.
All right.
If I start with the 2 questions on behalf of citizens. First of all is, why is there no desire to get rid of dependency on fuel-based vehicles, both public and private, through short-term actions and initiatives? And the second point is, could ministers drop the use of the state car for a period of 1 month and use public transport only?
I'll start with the short-term actions.
Yeah.
In terms of, is it about public transport and the move of public transport to low carbon, to remove the diesel from public transport fleet? One of the public and private. Well, I'll start with public first of all, and looking at the public bus fleet initially. One of the reasons why the technology has been changing quite dramatically actually in recent years, and not just in the car fleet but also in the public bus fleet, and I suppose we wanted to see how that developed before we would invest. So we're actually, Ireland is a kind of a follower and a fast follower, I would imagine, in this kind of technology. So the other issue that we had in the downturn was that we had limited funding in terms of purchasing fleet, and what we wanted to focus on was getting the most numbers of fleet to replace older fleet, and which would have reduced the other pollutants, which was the NOx and the particle pollutants. So we used our funds to invest in the largest number of fleet that we could, rather than investing in lower carbon emission fleet, because that fleet is more expensive. So for example, a hybrid bus is about 25% more expensive than a current diesel bus, and a fully electric bus is twice the cost of a current diesel double-decker. So that just gives you a feel for the numbers involved. So we did take a decision to invest primarily in numbers of fleet rather than, with our limited funding, rather than moving to the low carbon technology. But we are now moving into that space because there is additional funding available, and we hope to purchase the first low carbon double-decker fleet for next year, for introducing next year. We've already purchased a single-decker fleet and midi bus fleet, which actually meet the low carbon emissions, and they will be coming into service next year. So there is a desire to move, definitely a desire to move on the public bus fleet. On the electric fleet, maybe Brian might comment on that.
Just to add, in terms of the bus fleet, there has been a lot of change. We measure buses by Euro standards, and that's the emissions that they produce. And the Dublin bus fleet has changed quite a bit, and any of the modelling we have done shows that the emissions have reduced. In terms of the electric vehicles, in terms of incentives, I think the approach that I was talking about was the high cost in terms of subsidies for these electric vehicles. Is it worth the investment to have these subsidies in place now, or is it better to spend the money somewhere else in terms of promoting sustainable transport? That's how I would feel about that.
Very good. I think neither of you have any authority over ministers of state.
No.
So we'll pass on. The point has been made. We'll pass on that question. We'll hear the two members from the table. Yeah. Yes.
So I suppose the point was already made on table 12, so I'll just reiterate it quickly. In the context of rural Ireland, it seems kind of counterintuitive to hear from the NTA that we should reduce our dependency on transport, but I accept that you were talking about in regard to future planning and everything. But then in the context of the present, there's a question from the table as well on that.
Very good.
Hi, it's actually picking up on something, Brian, you've mentioned a couple of times. We had a robust discussion here about the fact that we can't provide, and it would be uneconomical to provide a bi-hourly bus service or an incredibly high frequency and quality public transport network for every small town, small village, even big town in Ireland. So would the panel get behind and could you suggest what a rural initiative would look like, where you would move to the electrification of private cars and indeed any public networks in a rural area that maybe wouldn't be applied to the Dublin, Limerick, Cork, Galway urban centres? Does that make sense?
Just to start off, in terms of rural parts of the country, there have been a number of schemes that have worked quite well. I'm not sure if SCII mentioned it the last time they were talking to you about the electrification, the electric car scheme on the Aran Islands, a very rural place where they provided electric cars, and it was quite successful. But in terms of transit, if somebody's unable to drive or doesn't want to drive, there are schemes around the world that look at, say, smaller or bigger taxis that are, again, more demand responsive. So as you go away from the urban areas into the more rural areas, the amount of space you require is less in terms of public transport. But those kind of things, that it may not be a bus, but it is a bigger taxi that's accessible, that could be used.
I think in particular what we're looking at is to get rid of a dependency on carbon fuel in a private vehicle setting in the rural environment, because the rural environment makes up such a big part of our society.
And that could be the point that I made a little bit earlier, that perhaps an incentive needs to be put in place in rural Ireland for electrification, if that's what we decide is the main option. There's ways that we would have to look at to see how Irish people would get around that, and how they would, like, people from Dublin could go to Mayo to buy a car and then bring it back to Dublin. But those types of incentives for people that don't have any other alternative, I would support.
Okay. And would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, well, I just probably like to make the point that it's like as if we're talking that there isn't any incentives at all in place, but there are some incentives. Now, they haven't kind of maybe incentivised people enough to transfer to electric fleet, but we have to, I suppose, acknowledge the fact that those incentives are there and they are continuing, like the VRT reduction, and there is an SCAI grant.
Which is only 5,000 euros.
And I suppose the big issue is that it was the cost of the vehicle, and I think we can see that
and
those
they're very
costs,
dear.
but those costs are coming down as more manufacturers will choose to produce kind of electric vehicles. But in terms of, I think from the NTA's perspective, we also support the fact that we are not going to be able to provide public transport to every location, But there are a number of other schemes that communities can get involved in relation to car sharing schemes, community car schemes that are actually provided for in legislation now that, you know, they up to then they would be considered taxis if you actually, you know, charged people for use of your car or covered your own expenses. But that's now available for people if they want to actually organise locally car sharing in their area. So it's another way that a citizens themselves can try and organise, if possible, to give people lifts, you know, and then reduce the use of cars alongside all the other means of public transport.
Can I just ask you the nature of the legislation? Is it taxation or something?
It's in relation to actually both taxation and it's actually or the requirement actually to have a taxi vehicle license if you're actually charging.
Yes.
You can actually have a community car scheme and you're not required to have a taxi license.
And is it in the Finance Acts you'd find the...
Yeah, you would, yeah.
I see. Yeah.
And the Taxi Regulation Act as well.
Yeah, very good. We're going to do table 7.
And then table 6. And then
and then we'll probably have to call it a day then. Yes.
Thank you. I'm the facilitator for table 7. Table 7 has a comment and a question on something that's been touched on by a few tables already. It's the strongly held view of Table 7 that pretty much everything we've heard today and generally in the media is Dublin centred. Dublin probably is the largest polluter and all the job announcements seem to be around Dublin. So the table was wondering, would a national planning policy on emissions be more effective if it focused on improving connectivity between other Irish cities and towns? You know, maybe through incentives and so on, which might then help to reduce the emissions associated with gridlock in Dublin City.
Very good. And is that the only question you have?
Yes.
Oh, thank you very much. And again, this seems to be
well, I think
in your bailiwick.
What's proposed in the draft national planning framework, national planning policy, addresses a lot of what you have asked there, which is looking at how the eastern region grows versus, you know, the western corridors, and I think what's set out in that will rebalance in terms of the growth of the state, and also look at how the major cities can grow, our regional cities grow, and connect then to the hub, which is the capital city in Dublin. So I think there is, and that is coming forward in a lot of the national planning framework at present.
Brian, do you want to comment?
I would agree with what Anne said. And yes, so a lot of the transport planning that we look at and we've spoken about has been Dublin centred, mainly because of the amount of people up here. It makes it more viable to do the big rail projects. But outside of the capital, the interconnection between the cities, yes, it would take pressure off of Dublin, and it can be done through transport. It could also be done through communications with the rollout of the broadband scheme, etc. That would reduce maybe the needs for some of the transport. But perhaps it does make sense, actually. It's a nice idea that we look at a model of connectivity that's not Dublin-centric, and we just focus on outside of the greater Dublin area.
Yeah. I'll go to table 6 next.
I'm the facilitator for table number 6, and the citizens at this table had 4 questions, but 2 have been addressed by other tables. One being the planning for outside of Dublin, other cities and rural areas, and the other one was on encouraging parents, you know, for school buses as opposed to private cars. The other question, the third question was, how does the panel feel on the weighting of the proposed spend on the national roads versus public transport, i.e. say 6 billion versus 3 billion, seeing that we're trying to encourage public transport? And, you know, what is driving this?
Brian, I think you might like to say something on that.
Yeah, I don't think it's good. I think if this is what we're trying to encourage is people to use public transport, the disparity between the two shouldn't exist if that's the investment that we want to do. We do need roads for public transport as well for buses. And also we need to also protect the asset that we've put in place in terms of the interurban motorway. So we can't cut back in terms of expenditure on the upkeep of that, but I do think that public transport if that's, as I've said, is one of the main solutions, we do need to prioritise funding for it. And we need to prioritise funding into multi-level budgets. It can't just be announcements of particular projects and then after a while there's a change of government or a change of minister and then the project goes by the wayside. The investment needs to be ring-fenced and the delivery needs to happen.
Yes. Anne, do you want to
Well,
add anything?
obviously, we would want to see additional funding going into public transport infrastructure because we want to deliver more public transport infrastructure. But at the same time, we do need to invest as a state in our roads infrastructure as well because it does support public transport. And if we are going to reduce the journey time between our regional cities, which is what we spoke about earlier, you know, we do need to improve the journey times between those, not just on road, but on public transport as well, which is facilitated by motorway or road development. So yes, of course, we would like to see additional funding going into public transport. We have seen, in terms of the recent budget announcements, more is going into public transport than is going into to roads in terms of additional spend. So that's a sign, I think, that the government is seeing that public transport investment is important, not just in Dublin but across the state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if I may put it this way, it cuts both ways.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
What type of
The fourth question
yes.
the citizens had then was, in order to discourage the use of private cars, there needs to be more connectivity between the public services. Is this being considered? Are there any plans for, say, the different strands of public transport to communicate with each other? And an example for this would be, you know, say if there was, I'm going to say, you know, fog delayed a bus to meet a train or vice versa, and that, you know, where is the connectivity with that?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a challenging kind of question. I suppose one of the first things that we did as a National Transport Authority was actually to put all the information related to public transport in one place. So on www Transport for Ireland, both on website and app, you can get all your public transport information right across the state and can plan your journeys on any public transport. So that was the first kind of time that we had all that information together. The next thing about planning and one mode communicating with another is a bit trickier because they're operated by different operators. It's something that we would like to work towards, but generally what we try and do is, particularly in the cities, if enough frequency of service available so that if one mode gets delayed, you're not going to get delayed if you are transferring to, say, a bus from a train to a bus, that a bus will actually come along a lot quicker. That's what we've been focusing on, is actually improving the frequency of service so that if there is delays on one mode, you're not left waiting for another mode. But yes, it would be an ambition, certainly of ours, to have that kind of level of communication, but it's a big project to put that in place. But at least with the National Transport Authority being in place, we have all the information, we have the contracts with the service providers, so we have the facility in being an authority in being able to do that. But it is a big project that would need quite a lot of investment.
Brian, do you have any observation?
I don't think anything that would add any value to what Anne has just said.
Yes, yeah. It's an interesting scenario, isn't it? Yeah. I'm sure some of the people coming here by public transport experience some of that.
Yes.
Yeah, getting from wherever to Houston and then getting to Connolly. And
He understands that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm a citizen of Table 6. I was just wondering, while we're planning on increasing frequencies of public transport and planning on ensuring that the fleet that we have is upgraded, what are we doing to ensure that the public transport system that we already have, that is timetabled, that is arriving and running as it's timetabled to do? For example, the only example I have is the bus route that I would use is the Fountainstown, Crosshaven, Cork, Ballincollig route, which is serving two major commuter towns for Cork City, that does not arrive on time. It's from Crosshaven and Carrick Line, we're timetabled every half an hour. This is not the case. In reality, people are on the ground waiting 2 hours for bus services. So while we're saying we want more frequent buses and adding extra times onto the timetables, we should really be focusing on ensuring that the timetables that we have already in place are running on time to put people's faith back in the capabilities of the public transport service that we have. Because in an ideal world, what we have in Cork is perfect, but it does not run like that on the ground. We have lost the faith in our transport system that we have existingly. So any more infrastructure that you do put in place, there is going to be no faith in it until we start running the way we're supposed to be running.
But of course, that's an operational problem. It's not.
It is, but we actually, because we're contracted to Bus Éireann to provide those services, we actually track, and now we have the facility because of the automatic vehicle location system that's on the bus. We can actually check and see what services they operate and how punctual they are. So our contracts are now set up that they have to, if they are not running the service, or if their punctuality is below a certain standard, we can actually fine them. So that's being introduced at the moment, and you will find that, I would hope that would improve certainly the reliability and punctuality of the services. But yes, I understand that there's a good way to go in terms of improving punctuality.
I'm going to take 2 more questions. We've gone over the 30 minutes. I'll take a question from table 10 and then a question from table 3.
Hello. I just want to frame this by, I suppose, with a contradiction maybe, that I'm a Limerick man. I'm looking forward to the recently announced motorway between Limerick and Cork. However, I will be voting for a reciprocation of the budgetary policy in the country, where 1/3 of the money goes into capital developments in the public transport sector, and 2/3 go into our roads. I take on board there are many initiatives mentioned here this morning with regards to the individual looking at the amount of carbon that he or she might use in any individual journey, and other things like the congestion charge, carbon tax, EU fines. These are all the sticks that can be used to beat individuals into using the least amount of carbon possible. However, I would like to focus on the carrot here, and I would like the Department of Transport, together with the Department of Finance, to look at the economic benefits for the Irish nation of not allowing the billions and billions of euros every year that leaves the country to other countries' budgets to pay for the diesel and for the petrol and for the gas that we use. If that money instead was used to develop our transport network and our electrical grid, to allow us to function as a nation without propping up other nations' economies and other nations' petrochemical industries. We don't have those petrochemical industries in Ireland. We don't have the same levels of them. I would like, and I suppose just I hope I've explained myself. I would like to the Department of Finance and the Department of Transport to look at the amount of money that would be saved by developing our infrastructure now into the future, the amount of money that we would save in the future, and borrow it now. Borrow it now so that we can accelerate this process, and in doing that and taking those savings, we can reinvest into our infrastructures. I hope I made myself clear. Thank you.
So we're really talking about the interconnection. We're really talking about the interconnection between energy and transport.
Exactly, yeah.
And the two sectors.
As you can see, transport is a big consumer of energy, very high consumer of energy. So we haven't really spoken about it. We've just assumed that energy is available and has been already transferred to be electrically generated, or by a sustainable means. So there is a knock-on effect by us actually transferring not just our private vehicles but also public vehicles to being generated through electricity, because that means then there's a higher demand on our transmission and on our power. So yes, I think it all has to be looked at in the round. Today we've just looked at transport as an isolated consumer of energy, but behind that then there is how is that energy generated?
Yeah, and we had interesting sessions on energy on the last weekend. Brian, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I suppose that the nub of the question or comment is around fuel security, in that we're not sending the taxes you said abroad. A lot of the things that both myself and Anne have spoken about in terms of shifting people to other modes of transport, that is having an impact at the moment. The amount of people that are walking and cycling and shifting towards public transport, that is having an impact. I would agree that perhaps in terms of the investment, that we need to think in much longer terms in terms of how we're investing our funds. And yes, maybe we should be borrowing to future-proof the country for fuel security.
Thank you very much. And the very patient Table 3.
Thank you, Judge. I'm the facilitator at Table 3. The citizens at this table had a couple of general questions for the Department of Transport. First question is, what is the Transport Minister doing in terms of climate change? How well is his department resourced? How much of a budget do they have? And then also in terms of time, how much time do they have allocated for climate change? What are the targets of the department? And then lastly, have the targets been achieved? And then one very quick comment from one of the citizens. And it's to do with one of the slides that Anne put up in terms of living closer to obviously work or to other transport. The comment is, unfortunately, obviously on the commuter belt, the cost of houses is very high, and it's not always possible for people to be able to buy there.
Yes, very good. Just in the interest of clarity, Anne represents the NTA, the National Transport Authority, not the department, but you may be able to sort of answer those questions in a general way.
Yes, in a general way. I mean, the Minister is committed, and he made an announcement yesterday about all the different grants and the tax, and continuing those in relation to trying to ensure that there is incentives in place to transfer the private fleet to electric fleet, but is also making available additional funding for the Bus Connects programme that I spoke about earlier, investment, 100 million in investment in cycling infrastructure and walking infrastructure. So yes, there is commitment, certainly at department level and minister level, to invest in sustainable transport. There is a climate change section within the department, so I would consider that they are well resourced. They've published, obviously they're involved in the National Mitigation Plan. They've published a national policy framework for alternative fuels for transport in Ireland. So they are definitely very much engaged in transferring and reducing the emissions, carbon emissions from the transport sector.
Thank you very much, Anne.
I don't have any comment other than that the analysis that has been done by the NTA and the department is very robust internationally comparing to other countries.
Yes, very good. Well, we've had a very, very interesting session, haven't we? I want to thank the speakers once again, Anne and Brian, and I think you might show your gratitude to them.